Chapter 6. Lesser Fireball. Published by Royal Road. The skies were as black as pitch, and a cold and relentless rain was falling over a small white temple in the northern part of the continent of Exodia. Inside it, a certain man with crazy ideas and a unique personality continued relentlessly running test after test. It was already the second day after his arrival, and he had barely slept or eaten anything. A level 1 being apparently could endure several days without food. As for the man immersed in his arcane theories, eating and sleeping were the last of his priorities at the moment, for he was each second closer to success. After finally calming down from the wonderful ecstasy of his discovery, Tekiel at last stopped laughing like a psychopathic maniac. It was good to revel in his own arcane discoveries, but the truth was that he still had much work to do before he could truly celebrate. His first and most obvious doubt was to test and prove that by turning off the vortex of arcane attraction, his ability to manipulate internal arcane energy was reduced by a factor of at least 10, in addition to the fact that he could no longer see arcane energy, which made some interactions reasonably more difficult. Tekiel continued his tests. The most obvious thing now was simply to try to activate an ability with this new capacity. Obviously, the ability he would test now would be Lesser Fireball. It was the only other ability he could attempt. After all, the translation ability was restricted to level 2, and arcane attraction he had already basically mastered. All that remained was to truly confirm his theories using Lesser Fireball. Moment of truth, now it's all or nothing. Tekiel did not hesitate to try. At worst, he would die blown to pieces. First he wanted to test a certain theory he had just thought of before going all in. Tekiel deactivated the arcane attraction through a mental image and used his reduced control over arcane energy, immediately beginning to channel his internal energy into a blue circle with a red central core, characteristic of Lesser Fireball. From the very beginning he had already been using energy manipulation without realizing it. He had simply been too stupid to notice. In the end, this had led him to discover other things that apparently were not meant to be common. Tekiel wasted no time. To his surprise, even with his reduced capacity compared to when he activated arcane attraction, he still managed to notice a huge difference when he attempted to activate the first red node by channeling his internal arcane energy. Apparently the first node contained far more complex information than he had imagined. It was not merely a sphere intended to conduct energy. The truth was much broader. The truth was that the red node held the information for the entire ability compressed within it. It was like a system of capillaries that would activate all the other nodes once energy was channeled through it. Another very practical example would be to compare the central node that contained the information to a brain commanding everything else. Tekiel had not seen this earlier due to his lack of knowledge. Man, I am so dumb. Forgive me, Mordenkainen. Tekiel could not help but slap his own face when he realized the implications of what he had just discovered. I must never draw hasty conclusions. Mordenkainen probably rolled in his grave upon receiving my unfounded criticisms, Tekiel muttered to himself before beginning the test after discovering the new implications. He began immediately. He channeled his internal energy into the red node that contained all the information of the Lesser Fireball ability. And it immediately unfolded like a flower into hundreds of other nodes with ease. A complete and stable model of the Lesser Fireball ability floated inside his mind at that moment. During the process he immediately felt his internal energy flowing and noticed the decrease of his energy bar by 5%. Interesting, Tekiel thought with his hand on his chin, still with his eyes closed. This was the first expenditure of arcane energy substantial enough for him to notice on his arcane energy bar. The situation now was very different from before, when he had inadvertently tried to create all the nodes individually with his own mental capacity. That previous approach of his was simply very stupid, to be honest, when he stopped to think about it. Well, he could not blame himself too much, after all. He was like a child beginning to crawl. No one could start their life running. At least not a human being. It was not as if the game had given him a manual with all the information simply saying, press this button to use such ability. Apparently the intention of the game's creator was only to point the player in the right direction without many conveniences and let their poor test subjects learn on their own. By energizing the red node with his internal energy, Tekiel immediately managed to feel how the correct activation should be. He saw the entire system of nodes as a whole, with various functions. They were like several areas of a brain, only infinitely simpler, obviously. Each set of nodes controlled a specific area. The central node contained the information and received the initial energy. The peripheral nodes controlled everything else. Now all he needed to do was test all these areas and get used to them. Each area apparently had a certain pattern slightly different from the other. One area adjusted the range, another the firing speed, and so on, such as the size and the power of the fireball. Tekiel quickly noticed that there were obvious limits. It was not as if he could inflate the ability with energy until it blew up a mountain with an attack comparable to a nuclear explosion. Everything made sense, after all. All parameters were firmly limited to level 1. All he could do was, at most, use weaker or stronger versions depending on the strength of the parameters he chose. The higher the parameter, the greater the final cost of arcane energy. But in the end, he could not surpass the imposed limit, as the parameters had a cap defined by the creator of the ability. Apparently, the only way to surpass these parameters was for him to create his own version of Fireball or acquire a stronger level 2 version with superior parameters. The first option seemed completely insane. Tekiel had already felt the complexity contained in the small central node of Lesser Fireball. Imagine having to design all that from scratch. It was completely unfeasible for him at the moment. Stopping his self-deprecation, Tekiel finally felt that he had learned the mage's alphabet. Now he was no longer a blind functional illiterate. This was the correct way to use arcane energy and abilities, after all. He had only discovered it now. Perhaps other people had already figured it out from the start. In fact, he bet that many could already have discovered this, for it truly seemed to be the standard method to activate an ability. As he channeled more energy into the central red node and chose the parameters, a small crimson fireball formed above the palm of his hand, floating like a tiny sun in the vacuum of outer space. Tekiel looked with a smile on his face at the ability finally activated correctly. Strangely enough, he did not feel the urge to laugh like a psychopath again. The feeling of being a complete idiot with his previous approach erased part of his baseless pride. Time for the practical test, he thought, turning toward the opposite side of the courtyard doors. Tekiel immediately aimed at a corner of the courtyard and fired the small fireball at a marble pillar. The attack shot through the air in a straight trajectory and collided with the pillar, generating a weak explosion of flames that did not go out for several seconds. Tekiel, having learned from his previous mistakes, did not dare execute the ability with all parameters at maximum inside a place inhabited by various people. At worst, he could kill himself or someone else if something backfired.